Did ancient humans care if a child was really theirs? Most people assume the answer is obvious. Of course they did. Of course, every man who ever lived wanted to know his children were his. But that assumption comes with something ancient humans never had: the actual ability to know. Every woman who has ever given birth in the history of our species has known beyond any doubt that the child was hers. She felt it grow inside her. She delivered it. The certainty is absolute, biological, and as old as the first living thing that ever reproduced through live birth. Men have never had that. For 300,000 years of Homo sapiens and for millions of years before that, through every hominid ancestor we've ever had, no man on earth could confirm he was the biological father of any child. There were no DNA tests, no blood typing, no genetic markers, nothing. Just the face of a child and whatever story he told himself about it. So, the real question isn't whether ancient humans cared. The real question is, what does caring look like when certainty is permanently impossible? What do you build an entire social system around when the most fundamental fact of parenthood is for half the species always unknowable? The answer starts with a face. In 1982, Martin Daly and Margot Wilson at McMaster University in Hamilton, Ontario, ran a study that was simple in design but striking in what it revealed. They surveyed new mothers, new fathers, and their extended families, grandparents on both sides, aunts, cousins, and asked each of them to describe who the newborn baby most resembled. But the father's relatives, his mother, his sisters, his extended family, overwhelmingly described the baby as resembling him, not the mother, the father. The consensus on the paternal side was so consistent, so lopsided, that Daly and Wilson didn't read it as a perceptual finding at all. They read it as a social one. Something deep in human behavior, probably unconscious, probably very old, was working to reassure the man in the room that this infant was his. A newborn's face is biologically designed to be unformed. The specific features that distinguish one adult from another, the nose, the jaw, the brow line, haven't emerged yet. Controlled experiments where strangers are shown photographs of infants find very little consistent resemblance to either parent. The face genuinely doesn't tell you much. And yet the people most motivated to see paternal resemblance, the people whose emotional investment depended on it, saw it the most clearly. This is not deception in any simple sense. The grandmother wasn't running a calculated scheme. Something subtler was happening, embedded in the social grammar of the moment. The baby looks like you, not because it necessarily does, but because that claim right then carries weight that goes far beyond aesthetics. And the recognition system doesn't stop at faces. Scientists ran a test. They gave fathers a set of baby clothes, no labels, no hints, just fabric worn by an infant. The fathers had to pick out which garment belonged to their own child without seeing the child, without any information at all. They got it right at rates far above random chance. And not just recognized, fathers also rated their own child's scent as more pleasant than the scent of unfamiliar infants. The human body was building tools for kin recognition that operated entirely below conscious reasoning. Long before language, long before the ability to read a newborn's unformed face, the ancient brain was already working on the paternity problem through smell. And paternal investment does track these cues. Studies examining how fathers across cultures allocate time, resources, and emotional attention consistently find that men invest more when they perceive greater resemblance to a child. The pattern holds even when men report no conscious awareness that resemblance is influencing their behavior. It runs beneath the surface. Martin Daly and Margot Wilson spent decades documenting what happens when these recognition signals fail, when doubt enters the picture, and a man has sustained reason to question whether a child is his. The statistical consequences for that child's well-being are measurable across multiple societies and multiple datasets. The machinery of paternal care runs in significant part on perceived relatedness. Here is what all of this means. Ancient humans didn't have certainty, but they had a system. An evolved, unconscious, socially reinforced system designed to operate under uncertainty to push men toward investment even when verification was impossible. Grandmothers noting that the baby had the grandfather's nose, infants whose smell felt familiar, communities that insisted on resemblance even when none clearly existed. The problem of paternity was never solved. It was managed through mechanisms so old they barely register as mechanisms at all. But here's the part nobody talks about. When researchers began looking at societies outside the Western model cultures that hadn't adopted the European assumption that each child has exactly one biological father, they found something that reframes the entire question. In many of these societies, the question, "Is this child mine?" wasn't just hard to answer. It was never being asked. Stephen Beckerman is an anthropologist at Penn State University who has spent much of his career documenting a belief found across more than 70 lowland South American societies. The belief is called partible paternity. In cultures like the Bari of Venezuela and Colombia, the Ashe of Paraguay, and the Curipaco of the Amazon basin, sex during pregnancy is understood not as infidelity, but as contribution. Every man who has sexual relations with a woman during her pregnancy is understood to contribute biological material to the developing child. Multiple men can each be partially responsible for the same infant. Multiple men can each be its father. Most Westerners encountering this for the first time read it as a polite fiction, a convenient cultural story that communities invented to manage the social fallout of infidelity without open conflict. Beckerman's data pushed back against that reading in a very specific way. He found that children with two or more acknowledged co-fathers had significantly higher survival rates than children with only one acknowledged father. Among the Bari children with two co-fathers survived to age 15 at a rate of 83%. Children with a single acknowledged father survived at 64%. That is not a rounding error. That is 1 in 3 children not reaching adulthood under a single father structure compared to fewer than 1 in 5 under a multiple father structure. The mechanism, once you see it, isn't hard to understand. More men who believe they have a stake in the child means more adults bringing food, providing protection, and stepping in during shortage. The ambiguity about biological paternity doesn't punish the child, it multiplies the child's support network. In 2010, Beckerman published a major analysis in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, mapping the evolutionary distribution of partible paternity beliefs across the continent. What he found was that these beliefs didn't cluster randomly. They were most prevalent in communities where male hunting success was highly variable, places where a single provider failing, getting injured, or dying in any given season could be catastrophic for a family depending on him alone. Multiple co-fathers weren't a cultural curiosity. They were insurance against the most predictable risk in the ancestral environment, the unreliability of any one person. And here's the kicker. The Western framework assumes that caring about paternity means caring about exclusivity, that a man who genuinely cared whether a child was his would demand certainty and withhold investment when certainty wasn't possible. Beckerman's data suggests the opposite was sometimes the most adaptive response available. In conditions of real scarcity and high infant mortality, dissolving the exclusivity question entirely, treating paternity as a social relationship built through investment rather than confirmed through biology produced better outcomes for children. These are modern peoples, not ancient ones. But the evolutionary pressures that shaped these cultures, unpredictable food supply, high infant mortality, small mobile groups with no institutional safety nets, are exactly the pressures that shaped the ancestral human environment for hundreds of thousands of years. The same picture comes from a completely different direction, not from living societies, from bones. Sabina Kvecek at the Field Museum in Chicago and her colleagues at the University of Chicago and the University of York published a study in the Cambridge Archaeological Journal. Their key site was Çatalhöyük in modern-day Turkey, one of the world's earliest known towns, roughly 8,000 years old. Thousands of people packed into mud brick structures side by side. And this community had a specific practice: they buried their dead beneath the floors of the homes they had lived in. Family members effectively stayed with the household after death. When Savechek's team examined the genetic relationships between individuals buried together as apparent household members, a significant portion of these people were not genetically related to one another at all. They had shared a living space. They had been treated in death as family. Their DNA said otherwise. Savechek's conclusion was direct. Even in prehistory, kinship was more than just blood relations. The people of Çatalhöyük were building social families, households organized around proximity, shared labor, and chosen membership rather than genetic connection. Biological parenthood was one pathway into the household. It wasn't the only one. This fits precisely what Sarah Blaffer Hrdy at the University of California, Davis has argued for decades. In her research on cooperative breeding, Hurdy has shown that humans are unusual among great apes in one critical way. Human infants have always been cared for by a network of adults, not solely by the mother. Grandmothers, aunts, older siblings, unrelated group members, what Hurdy calls alloparents, have been essential to human child survival throughout our evolutionary history. Among the Agta of the Philippines, alloparents provide approximately 75% of infant care, not a supplement. Three-quarters of all care delivered to young children comes from people who are not the biological parents. In 2008, Rebecca Sear and Ruth Mace researchers in London published a cross-cultural analysis of 43 societies. They were asking one question: what actually predicts whether a child survives? In 68% of those societies, a father's death had no measurable impact on his children's odds of survival. The grandmother's death, on the other hand, was almost always significant. The village was always raising the child. The father was one node in a network, sometimes an important node, but not the load-bearing one. Which brings us to a study published in September 2024 in Frontiers in Psychology that most people will never hear about but probably should. Gerd Gigerenzer at the Max Planck Institute for Human Development in Berlin and Rocio Garcia Retamero at the University of Granada surveyed fathers in both Germany and Spain on a simple question: had they ever conducted a DNA paternity test? Only 4% had. The test is cheap, widely available, and would answer one of the most consequential genetic questions in a person's life. And 96% of men had deliberately chosen not to ask it. Men didn't want to know. Not because they were incapable of knowing, but because knowing felt like the wrong move. Gigerenzer called this deliberate ignorance, the conscious protective choice to leave uncertainty intact rather than resolve it. Risk-averse men showed significantly higher rates of avoiding the test. The information could destroy a family, and the family was worth more than the information. Researchers have tried to estimate how often this actually happens. What percentage of children today are being raised by a man who is not their biological father, with neither party aware of it? The best estimates land somewhere between 1 and 3.7%. Low, but not zero. And for 300,000 years before DNA testing existed, every one of those cases looked exactly like certainty. No flag, no signal, no moment where the truth surfaced. A man looked at a child, detected resemblance, or didn't felt investment, or didn't, and the whole system kept running on something other than biological confirmation. That system, the resemblance detection, the smell recognition, the social pressure toward reassurance, the cooperative network of alloparents, the communities that buried their social families together, regardless of genetics, evolved precisely because certainty was never available. The human brain didn't develop a mechanism for knowing paternity. It developed mechanisms for functioning without knowing it. Now, you might be thinking of an obvious objection. If ancient humans were so comfortable with paternity uncertainty, why did almost every civilization in recorded history build elaborate systems to control it? Chastity requirements, adultery laws, virginity tests, the entire architecture of patrilineal inheritance. The answer is agriculture. When humans began farming around 10,000 years ago, land became property, and property needed to pass to an heir. Paternity uncertainty, which for hundreds of thousands of years had simply been a condition everyone navigated, suddenly became an economic threat. The control of female sexuality, the harsh penalties for adultery, the obsessive tracking of bloodlines, these weren't expressions of ancient timeless male jealousy. They were desperate attempts to engineer a certainty that biology never provided. Solutions to a problem that agriculture had created. That's the story of the last 10,000 years. But 10,000 years represents less than 4% of the total time our species has existed. Here is what I think the evidence is actually saying. The question, did ancient humans care if a child was really theirs, assumes that biological paternity was the fundamental thing being optimized. But the Bari survival data, the Çatalhöyük burials, the Agta alloparenting numbers, the cross-cultural finding that fathers were the least predictive kin for child survival, all of it points toward a different optimization. What was being maximized was not paternity certainty, it was the survival of the child. And the most reliable strategy for maximizing child survival was not to establish genetic certainty, but to expand the circle of invested adults. More people with a stake, more people who felt for whatever reason biological, social, habitual, chosen, that this particular child was in some sense theirs. The question, is this really my child, is in the deepest sense a modern question. It requires the concept of exclusive biological fatherhood. It requires the belief that genetic relatedness is the core of what kinship means. It requires the legal and technological infrastructure to make the question answerable at all. For most of human prehistory, those things didn't exist. The core of family was something else: presence, investment, the daily decision to show up and keep showing up. For 300,000 years, a man looked at a child and made a choice. Not about DNA, not about certainty, about whether to be there tomorrow and the day after that. The concept of really mine is a few decades old. The choice to act like it was, that's as old as we are. Think about this. Mothers and their relatives commented on resemblance in roughly equal proportions to both parents. Normal enough. But the father's relatives, his mother, his sisters, his extended family, overwhelmingly described the baby as resembling him. Martin Daly and Margot Wilson spent decades documenting what happens when these recognition signals fail. In 2010, Beckerman published a major analysis in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. Thousands of people packed into mud brick structures side by side, and this community had a specific practice. In her research on cooperative breeding, Hurdy has shown that humans are unusual among great apes in one critical way. Rebecca Sear and Ruth Mace, researchers in London, published a cross-cultural analysis of 43 societies. For the first time in human history, a man had something specific to transmit, and a very real reason to make sure it went to his biological child. It's nearly the only story most of us have ever been taught. That system evolved precisely because certainty was never available. The human brain didn't develop a mechanism for knowing paternity. More people with a stake. More people who felt biological, social, habitual, chosen, that this particular child was in some sense theirs. For 300,000 years, a man looked at a child and made a choice. Not about DNA, not about certainty, about whether to be there tomorrow and the day after that. The concept of really mine is a few decades old. The choice to act like it was, that's as old as we are.